My name is Krista Wilson, and I'm the president and senior consultant of Wilson & Associates Consulting. And I'm going to have the pleasure of sharing some data with you of what we learned from the community through the Listening Tours community conversations. I will warn you now, I'm not as funny as Manuel Pastor, but I will try to share data with you in a way that's lively. If this was a Grammys, I'd already have the time clock going and the hook to pull me off stage. So I'm hoping this didn't count toward my time. All right. So as you heard earlier today, traditionally, economic development doesn't include community voices in the forefront. Typically, and I know because I've been doing community engagement for over 20 years, you typically see community engagement when a project has been green-lighted toward the end of the process, not at the beginning, and especially not to get the vision, the wisdom, and the insights from community folks at the very beginning. With this project, it was very different. My firm, Wilson & Associates, had the joy of working with the Lee Andrews Group, the city's Economic Development Department, the Office of Equity, Vice Mayor Richardson's office to conduct a set of conversations to learn from folks at the grassroots level about what's required to lead economic inclusion. For many, and we heard this a lot in the community conversations, was what is economic inclusion? So you can see here there's lots of ways at looking at it, whether it be an economy where everyone has the opportunity to participate in the economic life of the city, or a local economy that works for everyone. We know that it also means that economic opportunity is delivered to those who have been traditionally underrepresented and marginalized in the economic development policies and practices of cities, counties, and regions. I mentioned we work with a very robust team, and I think the value of that is we had a lot of varying perspectives and various skills that helped us shape the community conversations listening tour. But let me tell you a little bit about what it was. So first, the listening tour is really grounded on the idea that we wanted to hear from folks about the policy solutions required to create economic opportunity to those who've been traditionally underrepresented and marginalized. In order to do that, we worked to help create a set of equity-based community focus groups that were called community conversations. And I actually have seen a number of the participants here in the room today, so it was nice to reconnect after the conversations have been over. In total, we facilitated 9 conversations and talked to 107 folks across the city of Long Beach, whether they be from the Cambodian community, youth, young people, African American or otherwise, to learn what are their recommendations to create economic inclusion here in Long Beach. Now, we know that there are many ways to hear from community members, whether they be town halls or community forums. But for this community conversations project, we utilized a traditional focus group model, which is really a set of intimate conversations where people can dive deep into what can often be sensitive topics. We know that the benefits of these focus group kinds of conversations include that people are more comfortable discussing sensitive topics. So I can share anonymously that across the 9 conversations, people told us stories of struggle about immigration stories or about poverty stories, challenges getting to and from appointments because they might have a disability that makes it difficult to get from a job or to employment. That's a lot of vulnerable, sensitive conversations that you often won't hear at town hall or large-scale conversations. And the intimacy really allowed us to have that deep listening that we wanted to craft solutions for economic inclusion. Others included that for our participants who were non-English speaking, it provided a safer space that encouraged their participation. These conversations also provide more time to go in depth. It's a lot easier to talk to 10 or 30 participants than 100 or 200, particularly when we're looking for solutions and ideas. And the last benefits, I would say, is that it allows an exploration of conversation topics, both in depth, and it provides an opportunity for folks to build on the ideas of others. And I think if you were to talk to some of the people who were involved in the community conversations who are here today, they would tell you that that was some of the benefits that they also experienced. So you heard throughout all the previous presenters that equity is an important ingredient of economic development, not just the sprinkles on the cupcake. And so for this project, equity was woven in through the design of the community conversation. So we wanted to uplift the 9 equity strategies that were utilized to help ensure that when folks were recruited to these community conversations, it was done in an equitable way, and the spaces themselves were ones in which promoted equity for all. You can see them here on the slide. First, the whole team partnered with local CBOs that have relationships with diverse populations. And you saw Sintro Cha in the video. That was just one of a few who were engaged. The second is that the team created multilingual marketing materials so that language wasn't a barrier to learn about the conversations and to participate. Next, the conversations were hosted at community-friendly locations, and they were held in the evenings or on Saturdays, because we know if we're talking about folks who are not traditionally engaged in civic life, city hall, that nights and weekends are typically more conducive to their participation. We also offered Child Watch, and you'll hear one of the solutions that folks mentioned was that for folks with children, that becomes a challenge for engagement and for work, so that the city offered Child Watch was a huge equity strategy as well. Additionally, all the materials were translated in English, Khmer, and Spanish. We also offered simultaneous interpretation during the sessions, which meant that for 2 of our focus groups, we had participants sharing in Spanish language, and we also had participants sharing in Khmer language. And in fact, in that particular focus group, I would say we had at least 15 participants who were monolingual Khmer speakers who were there and able to be engaged, thanks to an interpreter and some creative works with Rebecca and the team with our equipment. Lastly, 2 things. Food and beverage was provided, and I always say for clients that do this work, you can't underestimate the value of providing food and beverage. For the folks you wanted to talk to, oftentimes there's food insecurity. So the fact that they could inform the city's policies and also be provided with a meal was a large incentive for many to come, a double incentive. And lastly, the city provided a $10 gift card as both an incentive to participate, but I'll tell you, most people didn't know they were going to get the gift card. So it ended up being an appreciation of their time. They took about 2 hours out of their schedules to participate. So for the 9 community conversations that we held, we were really asking 6 questions that were connected to 6 learning areas around economic inclusion. Those areas were community economic well-being, the services and resources required to create an inclusive community economic development initiative or effort. The third was around how do you build economically resilient families. The fourth was around accessing banking and financial services. The fifth were strategies related to home ownership. And the sixth was around youth workforce development. So the result of those 9 community conversations that happened throughout, as you heard Rebecca say in the video, March and April, resulted in a report. And the report actually details 2 sections. The first were the key findings in those 6 areas. And then the second were, what were the solutions, the overarching economic inclusion solutions that we heard from the folks who participated. And so now I'll share 3 of those key finding areas, and then I'll invite my co-researcher, Laura Valles, to share the remaining key findings and the 12 community solutions. So when it came to community economic well-being, we asked folks, what does it look like when a community is doing well economically? And so they shared with us, well, those communities are healthy. There's a thriving business community. There's a safe and clean environment, and safe and clean also meant clean streets, clean public spaces, clean parks, as well as traditional public safety. Reliable transportation that also has true accessibility for folks with that are differently abled. We heard secure and stable housing, whether that be a home that's owned or a place that's rented. We also heard that there's a sense of community, a fabric, a brand that ties people together, and that within that there are both community resources and centers to access those resources. We also heard that there are strong economic opportunities and good wages. And while there's been a push for the 15, many folks in the conversations highlighted that it's not just enough for $15 in this Southern California economy. $15 an hour still requires multiple incomes in the home to cover rent and definitely to cover mortgages. Throughout the report, when it's published, you'll see that there were a number of quotes we highlighted. And so one here was that people spoke to that place, that sense of community. And we heard, and I'll quote, "A strong community has cultural centers. They're thriving. Museums, galleries, theaters, concerts, places where cultural activities can be held." And I wanna upload this or uplift this because that's not traditionally economic development. It's not jobs, it's not buildings, and not public spaces, but yet for people thinking about communities that are doing well economically, these are some of those ingredients. When we asked people, okay, so you've envisioned what this community could look like, we asked them, what are the services or resources that are going to be required to get that ideal community created? And we heard, first and foremost, financial literacy, programs and trainings to help people build the skills to navigate the financial world. Second, we heard requests for modified public school curriculum, that schools should be integrating these kinds of life skills into the traditional K through 12. We also heard from the business community and I would say people who don't own businesses that there's more support needed to help both create and sustain small businesses here in Long Beach. Community resource centers was another theme that people mentioned as a need that doesn't quite exist. Again, workforce and job development, affordable housing, transportation, and access to health services. Next, we asked people, what does it look like to be economically resilient? It's not just about the hourly wage or the amount in the bank, but it's about a sense of well-being and that financial stress isn't there, that there's a sense of ability to have that financial freedom. And so we asked people, if families are to be economically resilient, what would that look like? What would they need? What would those characteristics be? People would earn living wages, have quality jobs, be financially literate. There would be well-educated, there'd be financial freedom, and with all of that, those folks could then be civically engaged, and those residents would have stable housing. And you can see a quote here that people have to juggle sometimes. Do I go to work? Do I stay at home? Do I pay for childcare? And then what about that trade-off of income? So I'll actually invite my co-researcher to, and we just got the 5-minute mark, so we will rapidly go through the rest of the key findings and the community solutions, and then I'll come back for some next steps. Watch out for that. Clicker.
Good morning, everybody. I'm a lot shorter than Krista is. So I will quickly, I guess, since we got the 5-minute mark, review the last 3 findings as well as the solutions that emerged from our conversations. So the next finding was related specifically to banking and financial services. And so what we heard during the conversations were that when we asked them how they get information related to banking and financial services, they get that from a variety of sources, which is not surprising. First and foremost, they get that information online. And that's true even for folks who have experienced language barriers as they're accessing that information. They'll usually rely on family members or friends to help them translate the information, but that's one important source. The second is they rely on trusted community organizations as well as employers, particularly larger employers who are able to bring in financial planners or others who can help them with understanding sort of the kind of financial planning. The third source is, as I mentioned, family, friends, and peers. And lastly, they rely on banks and credit unions. And part of that is that they have experienced banking and other credit union and other institutions as sources that already provide that information very naturally. The second finding related to promoting home ownership. And so during our conversations, we asked participants if they had a magic wand, what would help them or someone they know buy a home. And so what they shared with us was that what would be really helpful to them is if they had access to home ownership programs. And in particular, what they were looking for is programs that help them with down payment assistance, lease to own, or ways to access low or no interest loans. The second finding was that if there were programs to support to provide them with home buying literacy and or to provide coaching. And this is support just to understand the process and to navigate that complexity. And then lastly, city-led reforms and protections. Part of what surfaced during the conversations was that home buying is such an expensive endeavor, particularly nowadays. And so having the city really play a key leadership role around that is really helpful to them. The third finding related to youth workforce development. And so when we asked participants what skills, knowledge, or training youth need to be prepared for the workforce, there were two key themes that emerged. The first was that they need apprenticeship programs and they need specific job opportunities that will help move them through a job pathway. And lastly, they need skills building, and this really relates to two things. Specific training as well as life skills, and so everything from how to dress for work and that kind of thing. So some of the solutions that emerged from the conversation, what we heard is that they need multilingual financial literacy classes and to be provided through the city, through schools, banks, and community-based organizations. Secondly, they need to be supported with more respectable financial institutions, such as credit unions and traditional banks, to help mitigate some of the challenges, particularly with predatory lending. The third solution that emerged was to establish diverse workforce development strategies that harness the skills of and talents of immigrants, that work to address the stigma of hiring people with disabilities, and that help create opportunities for formerly incarcerated persons. The fourth solution was to establish youth workforce development programs. I see 1 minute left. And then the next solution was to partner with local schools to help build workforce development and financial literacy embedded into the curriculum in the schools. The sixth solution was to create community hubs and resource centers to help foster relationship building and connect people to resources and services. The seventh solution was to provide small business development support, and these specifically are our efforts to connect entrepreneurs to funding and contract opportunities. And so there was a real emphasis on prioritizing local small businesses here in the city of Long Beach. The eighth solution was to develop internships and apprenticeship programs by working with the local small business community. The ninth was to support wage increases, and at a minimum to increase the wage to $15 an hour, but the cost of living is high, and so folks felt that higher salaries are really required here in Long Beach. The 10th was affordable childcare, and so Krista mentioned that earlier, but that would be one way to really support people navigating the workforce. The 11th is home buyer support, and then the last solution was to bring back a community redevelopment type agency. And so I'm going to transition back to Krista.
This is where the band would start playing. I'll just say it because I don't want to not share this. The city already has had this information, and I just want to really applaud the team that we worked with because they've already identified 5 next steps, and this thing is like just hot off the press. And so I just wanted to really quickly go through these 5. The first is that the city has identified the desire to craft culturally competent community-based solutions that are going to address these barriers in equity. The second is to foster community partnerships and secure resources to fund the 12 solutions that you heard Laura share. The third is we have these 12 solutions and the key findings. The city is going to create a 360-degree feedback process to communicate the progress made on the solutions. And this goes to Dr. Pastor's point about if there's no data, there's no evidence. And so number 4, implementing equity-focused structural and institutional changes in the city programs, policies, and procedures. And luckily you have the innovative Office of Equity and an equity-minded team at the city that will help really champion this. And the 5th is to establish mechanisms to evaluate progress and impact and then make adjustments as needed. So with that, that's a Speedy Gonzalez version of the Community Conversations Report. So pleased to share them, and then I'll invite the next member of the team up to continue with the agenda.